Picture this. You're walking through the heart of ancient Rome, the Forum, in the year 67 AD. The air is thick with the scent of incense and the briny tang of fish sauce wafting from nearby market stalls. Marble columns rise like silent sentinels, framing streets alive with merchants shouting their wares, senators in white togas whispering in shadowed corners, and slaves scurrying about their master's business. The afternoon sun glints off bronze statues of gods and conquerors, casting long, sharp shadows across the paving stones. You move with the crowd, swept along by the human tide, when a hush begins to ripple outward like a stone dropped in a still pool. All heads turn toward the open avenue leading to the Forum center. There, gliding into view with the easy arrogance of one who owns the world, is the emperor himself, Nero. The crowd parts instinctively, the way prey scatters before a predator. He is dressed in robes of deep imperial purple, threaded with gold, and his hair, carefully curled, gleams under the Mediterranean sun. But it isn't Nero alone who captures the collective breath of the crowd. On his arm walks a figure of such beauty that for a heartbeat you forget where you are. Draped in silks that shimmer like water and laden with jewels from the farthest edges of the empire, emeralds from Egypt, pearls from the Persian Gulf, she moves with the poise of someone accustomed to being adored. Her skin is pale, her eyes large and dark, framed by lashes so perfect they seem painted on. She is, in every outward sense, the image of an empress. And yet, the murmurs begin almost at once, sliding like venom through the crowd. Quiet words passed from mouth to ear, each voice weighted with disbelief and revulsion. "That's not a woman at all." The whispers grow bolder. "She was once a boy named Sporus." It is a name unknown to most of Rome, but not for long. What stands before you is not simply the emperor's newest companion. It is the living embodiment of one of the most disturbing transformations in the annals of power. A creation not born of nature, but forged by the will of a man who believed himself above the gods themselves. This is not merely scandal. It is something colder, darker. It is the quiet horror of a human life reshaped into a ghost of someone else, someone who is no longer among the living. You cannot help but watch as they pass, Nero's gaze fixed possessively upon the figure at his side. She does not meet the eyes of the crowd. Instead, her expression is an unreadable mask, the kind that hides not only thoughts, but entire truths. And in that moment, without yet knowing the details, you sense that behind the silks, beneath the jewels, lies a story of pain and survival so twisted and tragic, it will haunt you long after the sound of their footsteps fades into the marble colonnades. Because what Nero did to Sporus was not an act of love, nor even lust. It was an act of ownership, taken to its most grotesque extreme. It was the transformation of grief into obsession, of a human being into a living doll crafted to replace the dead. And to understand how the streets of Rome came to witness such a scene, we must journey back before the silks and the jewels, before the whispers and the spectacle, to the moment when an emperor's heart shattered and his mind followed close behind. Before we step deeper into this labyrinth of obsession and cruelty, take a moment to imagine the strange path that has led us here, not just through the streets of ancient Rome, but across almost 2,000 years of history. You and I are separated by oceans, perhaps by languages, and certainly by centuries. Yet right now, through the telling of this story, we're standing in the same place, shoulder to shoulder in the Forum, listening to the same whispers, feeling the same unease. That's the magic, and perhaps the danger of stories like this. They bridge time. They show us that behind the marble facades of ancient temples and the gilded titles of emperors, there beat human hearts, capable of love, cruelty, fear, and longing, just like ours. What you're about to hear isn't just the sordid tale of one Roman ruler's excess. It's a testament to the way power can warp the human soul until it becomes unrecognizable. It's about what happens when love becomes possession, when grief curdles into madness, and when one person's will has the force to erase another person's identity entirely. I won't pretend this will be an easy journey. There will be moments in this story that are deeply unsettling, acts of psychological and physical violation that would shock even the most jaded citizens of Nero's Rome. And yet, these are the moments that history too often leaves in the shadows. Ancient chroniclers like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio recorded these events, but they did so with the biases and political agendas of their time. They saw Sporus not as a human being, but as a curiosity, a living symbol of imperial decadence. Our task is to see him differently, not as an ornament in Nero's story, but as the central figure in his own. So as we move forward, think of this less as a recounting of historical gossip and more as an excavation. We will sift through the layers of propaganda, rumor, and myth to uncover the bones of the truth. We will reconstruct the world as Sporus saw it, from the oppressive grandeur of the imperial palace to the suffocating expectations of playing a role you never chose. And I invite you to do more than just listen. Imagine yourself there. Feel the weight of the silk robes, the sting of gold jewelry against skin, the crushing gaze of an emperor who believes you owns you, not just your body, but your name, your voice, your very existence. Imagine what it means to live every day inside someone else's ghost. If this story leaves you unsettled, it should, because the lessons it holds aren't just for historians. They're for anyone who has ever wondered what happens when the humanity of one person is stripped away to satisfy the desires of another. In Rome, the stakes were life and death. For Sporus, they were nothing less than the annihilation of the self. Now, let's pull back the curtain and meet the man who had orchestrated all, not as the mad tyrant of legend, not yet, but as a boy emperor full of promise, stepping into a role that would make him the most powerful and the most dangerous man in the world. Nero was not born the monster history remembers. When he took the throne in 54 AD at the tender age of 16, Rome held its breath in cautious optimism. Imagine the city then, still basking in the glow of Pax Romana, the great peace established under Augustus, yet restless under the weight of politics and ambition. The empire stretched from the wind-swept coasts of Britannia to the sun-scorched deserts of Egypt, an intricate web of roads, ports, and provinces binding 60 million souls under a single imperial hand. Into this world stepped Nero, a boy emperor with the lineage of two of Rome's most powerful dynasties, Julio and Claudian, woven into his blood. His early reign bore the fingerprints of those guiding him, the philosopher Seneca, his tutor, Burrus, the seasoned commander of the Praetorian Guard. Together, they tempered the impulsive young ruler, steering him toward policies that won the people's affection. Taxes were eased for struggling provinces. Lavish games and theatrical performances were held to entertain the masses, because in Rome, a well-fed and well-amused crowd was the surest guard against unrest. Nero himself stepped onto the stage, performing music and poetry before audiences who were as startled by his boldness as they were charmed by it. In these early years, the city whispered of a new golden age. Statues were erected, coins minted with his youthful profile, and the Senate, still hopeful, spoke of him with deference. For the common people, Nero seemed refreshingly human. He mingled in ways his predecessors would have scorned, walked among the markets, and shared in the entertainments of the plebes. In him, some saw the possibility of an emperor who could bridge the gulf between ruler and ruled. Rome, weary of the rigid, shadowy rule of previous emperors, welcomed this shift toward warmth and spectacle. But empires, like empires always do, demand more from their rulers than charm and public shows. Beneath the festivals and reforms, the machinery of imperial politics churned ceaselessly. Factions in the Senate jostled for influence, provincial governors whispered of autonomy, and in the corridors of the Palatine Hill, where marble floors echoed with the quiet footsteps of slaves and the rustle of silk curtains, power flowed like an invisible current, subtle, dangerous, irresistible. It was in this intoxicating environment where the emperor's word could change the course of a life, a province, even history itself, that the seeds of something darker began to root. For all his early generosity, Nero was still a boy raised to believe the world revolved around him, that the empire itself was his stage and its people his audience. And for a while, the applause was deafening. But applause fades, and in its place, silence can become unbearable. As the years passed, the checks and balances that had kept the young emperor in line began to crumble. One by one, his trusted advisors lost their influence or their lives. And in the void left behind, something began to stir inside Nero. A hunger for adoration that could never be satisfied, and a growing resentment toward anyone who threatened to steal even a sliver of that attention. It was under these shifting skies that he first encountered the woman who would ignite a fire in him, one that would burn through his reason, his restraint, and eventually his soul. Absolute power is a strange poison. It rarely kills instantly. Instead, it seeps into the mind, drop by drop, changing how a man sees the world and the people in it. In Nero's case, the transformation was gradual but unmistakable. By the mid-60s AD, the optimism that had greeted his early reign was beginning to crack, replaced by whispers of extravagance, cruelty, and a growing detachment from reality. Some of it, perhaps, was inevitable. Imagine being the only man in an empire of 60 million who could not be contradicted, whose word was law, whose whims could move armies, and whose displeasure could end a life before the sunset. Even the most grounded ruler might lose perspective under such conditions. For Nero, who already saw himself as an artist and visionary, it became dangerously easy to believe that his desires were not just personal wishes, but divine mandates. Paranoia, too, began to creep in. Rome was a city built on intrigue, its political life a web of alliances and betrayals. Plots, both real and imagined, seemed to lurk around every corner. The memory of Julius Caesar's assassination still haunted the Senate. Nero knew that daggers could just as easily be drawn for him. The more he feared betrayal, the more he isolated himself, surrounding his throne not with wise counsel, but with flatterers and sycophants eager to tell him what he wanted to hear. There were other pressures, immense ones. The empire's borders were restless, threatened by uprisings in distant provinces. Famines had stirred unrest in the city itself, and in 64 AD, the Great Fire of Rome swept through the capital, destroying vast districts and displacing tens of thousands. Ancient historians disagree about Nero's role. Some claimed he played his lyre while the city burned, others that he opened his own gardens to shelter the homeless. But in the minds of many Romans, suspicion had already taken root. All of this combined to make Nero increasingly unpredictable. The boundaries between his public role as emperor and his private desires began to blur. In his mind, the empire was his to shape as an artist shapes clay, bending not only policy and law, but people themselves to fit his vision. And when he met Poppaea Sabina, a woman who could match him in charm and ambition, that vision began to revolve entirely around her. She would become his muse, his obsession, and ultimately the catalyst for one of the most disturbing transformations in Roman history. But first, she would have to displace someone who already wore the crown. Poppaea Sabina did not simply enter Nero's life. She swept into it like a warm, intoxicating wind from the east, rich with the promise of pleasure and danger.
Her beauty was the kind that Roman poets strained to capture in verse. Skin pale as marble, hair the color of ripened wheat, eyes the shifting green of the Tyrrhenian sea under sunlight. But to think of her as only a vision would be a grave mistake. She was as calculating as she was captivating, armed with an intelligence sharpened by years navigating the treacherous waters of Rome's elite society. Poppaea came from a prominent family. Her father had served as a quaestor, and her mother was celebrated for her beauty. This background gave her not only status, but the kind of social education that could not be learned in books. She understood the subtle currents of conversation at banquets, the power of a well-timed compliment or a calculated silence. In a world where alliances could be forged or shattered over a single evening's entertainment, she was a master player. When Nero met her, he was already bound in a cold, politically convenient marriage to Claudia Octavia, the daughter of his predecessor, Emperor Claudius. Octavia was everything Poppaea was not: reserved, modest, and politically passive. In the rigid theater of Roman imperial life, Octavia played her role without flourish, quiet, dutiful, and unthreatening. For a man like Nero, who craved stimulation and flattery, she was little more than a piece of the palace furniture. Poppaea, by contrast, seemed carved for the stage. She was vivacious, witty, and unafraid to command attention. Where Octavia avoided the gaze of others, Poppaea courted it. She knew how to turn the heads of senators and soldiers alike, how to make her presence felt in a room without speaking a word. And she recognized something in Nero, a need so deep it bordered on desperation. He wanted not just a consort, but an audience, someone who could reflect back to him the grandeur he saw in himself. Their affair began in the shadows, like so many in the imperial court, but it quickly burned into something far more consuming. Ancient writers disagree on the nature of Poppaea's feelings. Some say she genuinely loved Nero, others that she was driven purely for ambition. The truth is likely more complicated. She may have seen in him both an opportunity for power and a man vulnerable to her charms. Either way, she stepped into his life not as a passing amusement, but as a force that would reshape his entire existence. To the court, their relationship was scandal enough, but for Nero, it was nothing short of a revelation. He had found someone who not only thrilled him, but challenged him, who could stand in the blinding light of his attention without flinching. And for a man like Nero, that was as dangerous as it was intoxicating. In the months to come, Poppaea would tighten her hold on him, and Nero's world, once an empire, would begin to narrow until it revolved entirely around her.
What began as a courtly intrigue soon swelled into something far more dangerous, a hunger that consumed the emperor's mind. Nero was not merely enamored with Poppaea, he was entranced, as if some divine enchantress from the old myths had stepped into his palace. The affair moved quickly, from secret meetings in candlelit chambers to public displays that left no doubt as to where the emperor's heart now lay. Nero's fixation revealed itself in ways that startled even the jaded aristocrats of Rome. He stationed guards around Poppaea, not only when she ventured into the city, but even within the palace itself. Their duty, he claimed, was to protect her. But those who served in his court knew the truth. These guards were less protectors than watchers, ensuring that no man so much as lingered too long in her gaze. The gifts began to flow like water from a burst aqueduct. Nero lavished her with silks from China's distant looms, their shimmering threads arriving after months of perilous travel along the Silk Road. He gave her perfumes distilled from Arabian flowers, their scent so rare and potent that a drop could fill a chamber for hours. Jewels from the mines of India,
carved ivory from Africa, and gold beaten so thin it floated in the air. All poured into her hands as if he sought to drape her in the wealth of the known world. But the most telling gift Nero gave her was not material. It was the rewriting of reality itself. He divorced Octavia, a move so politically reckless it alienated entire factions of Rome's elite. The public, who adored Octavia for her modesty and royal bloodline, murmured their disapproval in the streets. But Nero was unmoved. In his mind, this was not merely a marriage, it was an imperial declaration that his will alone defined the order of things. The wedding that followed was a spectacle without precedent. The palace was transformed into a vision of opulence, its halls lined with garlands of flowers imported from Egypt, petals kept fresh by constant misting. Musicians played throughout the night, their lyres and flutes weaving harmonies that floated on the warm Roman air. Senators and generals came dressed in their finest togas, each gift they presented outdone by the next. For Nero, the wedding was more than a union, it was a performance, and the city of Rome was his audience. And yet even marriage could not satisfy his need to possess Poppaea entirely. He began to close her world, cutting her off from friends, isolating her from family. Her attendants were chosen for their loyalty not to her, but to him. Every conversation, every letter, every glance from another man was filtered through the emperor's gaze. This was not love in any human sense. It was ownership. Nero saw Poppaea not as a partner, but the most precious artifact in his collection, one that must be guarded, polished, and kept from any touch but his own. And Poppaea, for all her intelligence and ambition, seemed willing to play along. She understood the volatile nature of Nero's affection, how quickly it could turn from adoration to destruction. She used her position to elevate her allies, secure advantages for her family, and weave her own network of influence. But even she could not have foreseen how dangerous it was to be the center of Nero's world. For in an empire ruled by a man who believed himself above the gods, obsession was only ever one heartbeat away from ruin.
When Nero cast aside Octavia, the political earthquake shook Rome to its core. Octavia had been more than just an empress. She was the living link between the Julio-Claudian dynasty's past and its present. To the public, she represented dignity and continuity. To the Senate, she was the daughter of a former emperor and a guarantee of political stability. Her removal was not only a personal slight, it was a defiance of tradition, a declaration that Nero would not be bound by the expectations of the ruling class. The marriage to Poppaea, Sabina in contrast, was staged as an imperial dream. The ceremony was nothing short of theatrical genius. Guests entered a hall where gold leaf covered the walls, reflecting torchlight until it seemed the entire space glowed. Incense coiled upward from silver braziers, mingling with the scent of roses scattered in thick carpets across the marble floor. Every detail had been arranged to proclaim one message. Nero's devotion was limitless, his resources inexhaustible. In the ancient Roman world, marriage was as much a public statement as a private union. For most emperors, it was a strategic alliance. For Nero, this marriage was spectacle, art even. He took the role of groom as though he were playing a part in one of his beloved stage productions, ensuring every gesture, every word, every gaze was worthy of an audience. Yet, behind the dazzling facade, Poppaea's reality was far less romantic. Once the public vows were spoken, Nero's control over her life tightened like a drawn bowstring.
She was moved into a suite of rooms deep within the palace complex, where every doorway and corridor was guarded by men loyal only to him. Friends who had once visited freely now found themselves turned away, often without explanation. Letters she wrote were intercepted. Letters sent to her rarely reached her hands. Her attendants, hand-picked by Nero, were not companions, but informants. They reported her conversations, her moods, even the tone of her voice. If she seemed unhappy, Nero wanted to know. If she lingered too long at a window, watching the gardens below, he wanted that too. Outside the palace, the city buzzed with gossip. Some claimed Poppaea welcomed the isolation, preferring to be the sole focus of the emperor's attention. Others whispered she was a prisoner in all but name, trapped in a gilded cage. Whatever the truth, she understood the rules of survival in Nero's Rome. Never contradict him in public, never allow anyone to see weakness, and always remain the image he wanted the world to see. Still, Poppaea was no passive ornament. She continued to exert her influence where she could, securing positions for her allies, arranging favors for those she trusted, and building a private network of supporters who might shield her if Nero's love ever curdled into suspicion. But as much as she played her part, Poppaea had a flaw, dangerous in an emperor's court. She spoke her mind. Unlike the sycophants who surrounded Nero, she was willing to challenge him. And in a palace where no one else dared speak an unvarnished truth, such defiance was as intoxicating to Nero as it was perilous. It was only a matter of time before a moment of defiance would set in motion the tragedy that neither of them could escape.
The summer of 65 AD was heavy with heat and tension. Rome shimmered under the relentless sun, and the palace seemed to magnify every spark of irritation between Nero and Poppaea. By this point, their marriage had settled into a dangerous rhythm, passionate devotion interrupted by sudden storms of temper. Nero's moods had grown increasingly unpredictable, swinging from exuberant generosity to volcanic rage with little warning. On the day it happened, the details depend on which ancient historian you believe. Tacitus claimed the argument began over Nero's obsession with public spectacles, his endless chariot races, his performances on stage, his ceaseless hunger for applause. Poppaea, pregnant at the time and already wary of his neglect as a husband, is said to have challenged him, accusing him of caring more for the roar of the crowd than for the responsibilities of fatherhood. Suetonius tells a slightly different story, that the quarrel began over some minor domestic slight, an argument that escalated beyond reason. Cassius Dio, always eager for drama, painted the scene as a clash of two powerful personalities, each unwilling to yield. Whatever the truth, the common thread in every account is this: Poppaea dared to stand her ground. She did not bow her head, did not soften her words. Perhaps the heat of the day made her impatient. Perhaps the strain of pregnancy made her less willing to endure his whims. But in that moment, she spoke with the clear, steady voice of someone who would not be silenced. And Nero snapped. Whether it was a single savage blow or a sustained attack, the result was the same: violence delivered with such force that it caused fatal injury. Many sources speak of a kick to her abdomen, the impact shattering not only her body, but the life growing within her. She collapsed on the polished marble floor, her breath ragged, her face pale with shock and pain. It is said that in the instant after the act, Nero's fury dissolved into panic. Here was the woman he had adorned like a goddess, the center of his world, lying broken before him. The emperor who commanded legions and ruled over continents found himself powerless in the face of his own deed. He called for physicians, offering them riches beyond imagining if they could save her, threatening them with torture if they failed. But Roman medicine, for all its skill in setting bones and treating wounds, could do little for such catastrophic internal injuries. Poppaea lingered for only a few hours before death claimed her and the unborn child she carried. And with her passing, something inside Nero twisted beyond repair. The man who had once been the youthful hope of Rome, who had promised a golden age, now stood over the body of the woman he claimed to love more than life itself, killed by his own hand. The Senate would not condemn him. The people would not revolt. No court would hold him to account. But Nero himself would never again be entirely sane.
In the hours after Poppaea's death, the imperial palace became a mausoleum draped in silence. Nero, pale and hollow-eyed, refused to allow her body to be prepared according to Roman custom. Normally, the deceased would be cremated, their ashes placed in a family tomb. But Nero could not bear to see her burned. Instead, he ordered her embalmed in the Egyptian style, a foreign practice considered unusual, even scandalous among the Roman elite. Her tomb was built with speed, but no expense spared. Walls of polished marble, doors of gilded bronze, and a ceiling painted with constellations so that she might rest beneath an eternal sky. Gold and jewels were placed alongside her body, as though she were an empress of legend, rather than a mortal woman who had died violently in her own home. But Nero's devotion did not end there. He declared Poppaea divine, establishing a cult in her honor. Statues of her were erected across the city, ivory, bronze, marble, each crafted to capture the softness of her smile, the tilt of her head, the perfection he remembered. The court was ordered to refer to her in the present tense as if she still lived. At banquets, her seat was kept empty but adorned with fresh flowers and costly silks. Servants were made to lay out her favorite dishes, their scents filling the air before being quietly removed untouched. And Nero himself, whether out of grief, guilt, or a mind slipping further into delusion, spent long hours speaking to her embalmed body, convinced she could hear him. Witnesses claimed he whispered to her about the matters of state, recited his poetry, and begged for her forgiveness. Others said he wept like a child, clutching the silks that had once wrapped her shoulders. This was no ordinary mourning. It was a refusal to let go, a reshaping of reality to suit his will. And for those who served him, it became a dangerous performance. Courtiers were expected to play along, to speak of her as if she still occupied her chambers, to pretend they could hear her voice in the gardens or see her walking in the colonnades. Anyone who suggested it was time for the emperor to move on risked exile, or worse. In this feverish atmosphere, the court became a theater of the macabre, with Nero as both playwright and leading man. And it was during this surreal chapter of his reign, with grief and delusion entwined, that Nero first saw a young man in his household whose face would stop him in his tracks. The resemblance was uncanny. The boy's name was Sporus, and from the moment Nero looked at him, the seeds of another tragedy began to take root.
Sporus was likely no older than 14 or 15 when fate placed him in Nero's path. Born into slavery within the imperial household, he had known the marble corridors of the palace all his life. Unlike many slaves, he had been freed while still young, a mark of favor that suggested he had been destined for service in the administrative ranks, perhaps as a secretary or steward. In such a role, he would have enjoyed certain privileges, better food, finer clothes, and the rare chance to learn to read and write in both Latin and Greek.
But those privileges came with an iron chain of dependency. Freedmen of the imperial household owed everything to their former master. Their status could be elevated to influence or stripped away to ruin at a single word from the emperor. They lived in a fragile balance between favor and oblivion. What caught Nero's attention was not Sporus's skill or intellect, it was his face. Ancient sources, Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, agree on this point. Sporus bore an extraordinary resemblance to Poppaea Sabina. The likeness was not exact, but in the delicate curve of his cheekbones, the shape of his lips, and most of all in his large, expressive eyes, Nero saw the ghost of the woman he could not let go. In the superstitious world of Rome, where appearance was often thought to reflect inner essence, such a resemblance could feel more than coincidence, it could feel like a sign. To a man already sliding into delusion, it was as if Poppaea had returned to him in another form. But there was, of course, one problem. Sporus was male. For most people, that would have been an insurmountable fact. For Nero, who had declared himself an artist of life as well as a ruler, it was simply another challenge to be overcome. And in his mind, there was a way to do it. What Nero conceived next was not just an act of possession, it was an act of total transformation. He would not merely dress Sporus as a woman, he would erase his identity entirely, molding him into Poppaea's image until the distinction between the two vanished. For Sporus, the moment Nero's gaze lingered too long was the moment his fate was sealed. He could not have known it then, but his life was no longer his own. The emperor's grief had found a new vessel, and that vessel was him.
From the moment Nero decided Sporus resembled Poppaea, the boy's future was no longer measured in choices, but in what would be done to him. The emperor did not simply want a companion to remind him of his lost wife, he wanted Poppaea back in flesh and blood, as if death itself could be defied by imperial will. And for Nero, there was only one way to achieve that illusion. Sporus must be transformed, permanently and completely. The first step was the most brutal. Nero summoned the finest physicians in Rome, men accustomed to treating senators and generals, and gave them an unthinkable order. Sporus was to undergo surgery to remove all signs of manhood, not for any medical necessity, but purely for the emperor's desire. In the ancient world, such procedures were crude, dangerous, and often fatal. Without the antiseptics or advanced instruments we take for granted, survival depended on the patient's youth, strength, and sheer luck. The operation would have been carried out in the palace itself, within chambers prepared for both secrecy and control. Guards, likely men from the Praetorian Guard loyal to Nero personally, stood ready to hold the boy down if he resisted. Pain relief would have been minimal, perhaps only a strong wine laced with opium resin, and even that could not dull the agony completely. The metallic scent of iron tools, the heat of oil lamps, the rough voices of surgeons, it would have been a waking nightmare. For hours, Sporus would endure this violence upon his body, knowing there was no escape. The risk of death from blood loss or infection loomed over every moment. If he survived, he would awaken to find himself forever altered, not just physically, but in how Roman society would see him. He could never father children, never be considered a fully masculine citizen, never claim the traditional roles of a Roman man. But Nero was not finished. The emperor's vision was one of total recreation. Sporus would not simply live, he would live as Sabina, a title taken from Poppaea's own name. Every trace of his old self would be overwritten, every habit, every gesture reshaped to fit the mold of the woman Nero remembered. What began as an act of grief had become something far darker, a deliberate erasure of identity, carried out with the precision of an artist, sculpting marble, except the medium here was a living soul.
and as Sporus recovered from the physical wounds, he would learn that the real torment was only just beginning.
Recovery from the surgery was slow, measured not in days but in weeks, perhaps months. Sporus, now renamed Sabina, was housed in a private wing of the palace, tended to by physicians and attendants who understood their orders were as much about shaping the emperor's vision as they were about preserving the boy's life. The transformation began with clothing. Imperial seamstresses, sworn to secrecy, measured and remeasured him for garments cut in the latest styles worn by Rome's aristocratic women. Flowing stolas of imported silk were tailored to soften his frame and disguise what the surgery had not removed. Gowns were dyed in deep Tyrian purple and edged with gold thread so fine it caught the light like a flame. Then came the jewelry, pieces Poppaea herself had once worn. Heavy necklaces of emeralds and pearls draped across his chest, bracelets from Parthia clasped at his wrists, and delicate earrings that brushed his cheeks when he moved. Each ornament was more than decoration. It was a physical link to the dead empress, a reminder of the role he was now required to play. Cosmetic artists were summoned from across the empire. They taught him how to line his eyes with kohl to make them appear larger, how to dust his cheeks with red ochre for a flush of life, how to powder his skin with ground chalk to achieve the pale glow prized among Rome's elite women. They reshaped his eyebrows, plucked hair from his face, and painted his lips with crushed berry pigments. Hairdressers, too, worked their craft. Sporus's hair was grown out, curled with heated bronze rods, and arranged in elaborate styles copied from Poppaea's portraits. Intricate braids crowned with jeweled pins, or loose curls bound with ribbons imported from the East. The process could take hours each morning, attended by a small army of slaves. But the most invasive part of the transformation was not physical, it was behavioral. Tutors drilled him in the posture and movements of a high-born Roman lady, how to sit with ankles crossed and chin lifted, how to walk so that the hem of her stola swept gracefully without tangling, how to extend a hand in greeting so the light caught the gemstones at her wrist. Voice coaches worked to raise the pitch of his speech, teaching him to adopt the softer cadences expected of an imperial consort. Every day, mirrors became his prison. Each reflection showed less of the boy he had been and more of the ghost Nero demanded him to be. The face staring back was beautiful, yes, but it was not his own. And yet the most haunting part of this transformation was not the loss of his appearance, but the loss of his name, his history, his self. In the palace, no one called him Sporus anymore. He was Sabina, the second life of Poppaea, a living monument to Nero's delusion. Every gesture, every smile, every word had to be rehearsed for an audience of one. Soon, Nero announced the final act of this recreation, a wedding. The emperor would marry his newly made empress in full public ceremony, erasing the last boundary between grief and madness.
Spring of 67 AD arrived in Rome draped in blossoms and heavy with the scent of incense. The city prepared for a wedding unlike any it had ever seen, or would ever see again. Nero, in the full bloom of his delusion, declared that the ceremony would honor not only the living, but the dead, sealing the union between himself and the person he insisted was the reincarnation of Poppaea Sabina. Preparations consumed months and emptied coffers. Craftsmen were summoned from the farthest provinces to gild palace halls with gold leaf and to inlay the marble floors with intricate mosaics of doves, roses, and intertwining laurel vines. Massive amphorae of imported wine stood ready, their surfaces painted with scenes of Venus blessing a mortal couple. Garlands of lilies and violets, flowers sacred to marriage, were strung across colonnades, their fragrance heavy in the warm spring air. Sporus, now Sabina, was dressed in a bridal stola of such fine silk it seemed to ripple like water with every movement. Tyrian purple borders marked the garment as imperial, while a veil of sheer fabric, dyed the pale gold of dawn, covered his carefully arranged curls. On his neck rested a heavy necklace of pearls that had once belonged to Poppaea herself. It was not simply an ornament, it was a chain, binding him to the identity he had never chosen. The guest list read like a map of power in Rome. Senators draped in white togas with purple stripes, generals gleaming in ceremonial armor, priests of Jupiter and Venus, and foreign envoys come to witness the spectacle. Yet beneath the layers of formality, there was tension in the air. Every guest understood that they were not merely attending a wedding. They were participating in an unspoken command performance. No one could afford to appear anything less than delighted. The ceremony followed Roman tradition in form, if not in spirit. Hands were joined over a sacred altar, vows exchanged, and the dextrarum junctio, the clasping of right hands, was made before the watching crowd. Bread was broken and shared between them, symbolizing their shared life. Musicians played love songs on lyres and flutes, while dancers, clad as cupids, flitted between tables. From the outside, it might have looked like any lavish imperial wedding, but for those who knew the truth, the sight was deeply unsettling. The most powerful man in the world marrying a teenage boy surgically altered and remade to mimic his dead wife. And yet, in Nero's eyes, this was no mockery. It was triumph. He had conquered death, resurrected beauty, and bound it to himself in the most public way possible. Rome's nobility might whisper in private, but in the great hall of the palace, under the blaze of oil lamps and the scrutiny of guards, all anyone could do was raise their cup and toast to the emperor and his empress. For Sporus, the wedding marked the point of no return. Whatever life he had before was gone, replaced entirely by the role he was forced to play. From that day forward, his existence would be a performance. Every glance, every word, every step, choreographed to please a man whose love was as dangerous as it was inescapable.
After the wedding, Sporus, now publicly and irrevocably Sabina, was installed in the palace not as a concubine or servant, but with the full ceremonial privileges of an empress. He was given his own suite of opulently decorated chambers, complete with marble columns, painted ceilings depicting Venus and her retinue, and floors inlaid with exotic stone imported from Numidia and Asia Minor. The furniture was carved from dark African ebony, the cushions stuffed with swan's down, the air scented with rare perfumes from Arabia. A household staff was assigned to him, stewards, scribes, attendants, and personal slaves, each sworn to serve his needs, but ultimately answerable only to Nero. His personal expenses were drawn directly from the imperial treasury. He was given his own litter, carried by 8 liveried bearers, and a string of horses for when the emperor wished to ride through the city with him at his side. But for all the outward trappings of power and privilege, the reality was suffocating. Sporus's every movement was bound by the expectations of his role. He was expected to attend all imperial functions, seated beside Nero at banquets, dressed in the most exquisite garments, and adorned with jewels heavy enough to leave marks on his skin. At public spectacles, he was presented as the Augusta, the Empress of Rome, smiling graciously while Nero basked in the reflected glow of his own illusion. In private, the demands were more sinister.
Nero did not treat Sporus as a separate person, but as the resurrected Poppaea, continuing conversations as if they had been interrupted only yesterday, recalling events Sporus had never lived and expecting him to respond with perfect familiarity. When Nero reminisced about a shared evening in the gardens or a private jest from years past, Sporus was expected to smile knowingly, to laugh at the right moment, to echo the ghost of a woman he had never been. It was a daily performance with the highest possible stakes. One wrong word, one flicker of hesitation, and Nero's temper could flare. Ancient sources suggest Sporus developed an almost preternatural ability to anticipate the emperor's moods, reading the smallest shifts in tone or expression and adjusting his responses instantly. It was not merely survival, it was an art form, honed under the constant pressure of a man whose affections could turn to violence without warning. The physical transformation had been completed, but the psychological transformation was ongoing. Every morning, Sporus awoke in rooms filled with reminders of the dead woman he was meant to embody. Her portraits, her jewelry, her furniture, even her favorite flowers placed fresh each day. Every night he fell asleep knowing he would have to do it all again tomorrow. For more than 2 years, he lived inside this constructed identity, not as himself, but as a shadow, a reflection, a ghost. To the Roman public, he was an oddity, a symbol of Nero's eccentricity. To the imperial court, he was a dangerous reminder of the emperor's instability, both too valuable and too dangerous to confront. And when Nero decided to leave Rome to seek glory abroad, Sporus had no choice but to follow him, displayed before foreign eyes as the Empress of Rome, a fiction that no one dared publicly challenge.
In 66 AD, Nero's attention turned toward Greece, a land he revered as the cradle of art, philosophy, and athletic glory. For years he had fancied himself more than an emperor. He believed he was a true artist, a performer whose genius could only be fully appreciated in the lands that had birthed Homer and Sophocles. The Roman stage, he thought, was too small for his talents. So began the Grand Tour, an imperial procession across the Aegean. Nero traveled not as a ruler visiting provinces, but as a competitor in Greece's most prestigious festivals, the Isthmian Games, the Pythian Games at Delphi, and even the sacred Olympic Games themselves. In each, he entered contests for singing, lyre playing, acting, and chariot racing. Judges and audiences alike knew the truth. No matter the performance, the emperor must win. And so he did. Every time, garlands and crowns showered upon him in what was less a competition than a carefully staged homage. Wherever Nero went, Sporus followed, presented to Greek elites as the Augusta, Rome's empress. Dressed in flowing Greek chitons and crowned with wreaths of myrtle, he walked beside the emperor in processions through marble amphitheaters and sacred groves. Foreign dignitaries, accustomed to Rome's military might, but unfamiliar with its emperor's peculiarities, struggled to reconcile what they saw: the conqueror of nations parading a soft-spoken feminine figure who was clearly not what Nero claimed him to be. To question the illusion was dangerous, so they played along. Banquet halls rang with polite toasts to the empress, while behind closed doors, whispers turned to nervous laughter or quiet disgust. Yet in public, the fiction held. For Sporus, the Greek tour was a stage upon a stage. Every appearance was another act in a performance that had no end. He stood beside Nero in temples dedicated to Apollo, in theaters built for tragedy and comedy alike, in front of statues of gods who embody beauty, strength, and freedom, qualities that must have seemed bitterly ironic to someone living as the property of another's fantasy. The tour stretched on for more than a year. Nero's appetite for praise was insatiable, and Greece gave him all the adoration he demanded, though it was hollow, born of fear rather than love.
When he finally turned back toward Rome in 68 AD, garlanded with victories he had awarded himself, the empire he returned to was no longer stable. Beneath the celebrations, rebellion was brewing. And Sporus, bound to Nero's side, would soon find himself swept into the chaos of an emperor's final days.